And I will begin today by acknowledging that I am speaking from the traditional Stalo territory. And on behalf of the people of Chilliwack Hope, I want to acknowledge the suffering and trauma that the discovery of the remains of 215 children at the residential school in Kamloops has brought to residential school survivors in our community. We stand with you during this difficult time and are committed to doing the hard work necessary to bring about true reconciliation in our community and across the country. And I want to thank Stalo communities and their leaders for being so willing to partner with people in Chilliwack and Hope and the surrounding areas to build towards true reconciliation. They truly are leaders in our country in this regard. I want to speak about the motion today and what I appreciate about it. There are parts of it, as has been referenced by some of my colleagues, that I'm less enthusiastic about than others. But overall, this is a rather comprehensive call to action. And I think that is exactly what my constituents are demanding in light of the revelation from Kamloops. They want action. They don't want any more words. They don't want any more commitments. They want to see us move forward together, and that is what this motion calls for, and that's why we will be supporting it. I have been, I think some of the language, we don't know what to say. So we say things like we are shocked or, and quite frankly, as parliamentarians, we shouldn't be. There's an entire volume of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report, Volume 4, entitled Missing Children and Burial Information. It's 266 pages long. And the release of that volume itself should have shocked Canadians when it was tabled in 2015. The exceedingly high number of student deaths relative to the non-Indigenous population, the lack of notification to families when a student passed away, the purposeful decision to refuse to send bodies home to their families due to the cost that would have borne on the federal government, the desire for Christian burial rites to be performed on deceased children over traditional Indigenous burial rites. All of this was documented and reported on, and it's been in our in public in media reports for 100 years. But Canadians didn't want to hear it, and they didn't want to believe it. And thanks to these revelations from Kamloops, Canadians believe it now, and they're demanding action. Residential school survivors told us that this had happened. Families who never saw their children again after they were abducted and taken to residential school told us this had happened. We heard, but we did not listen. And we believe them now. I think this is a watershed moment for Canada. It's a moment where the knowledge has moved from a fact of our history to a feeling that compels us to act. But we've had this feeling before, and we can't let this moment slip through our fingers again. Momentum for change and for action was lost between the historic apology that took place on the floor of the House of Commons in 2008 and the issuing of the final Truth and Reconciliation Commission report in 2015. More momentum has been lost since the issuing of that report and now. We cannot let this moment pass without seizing upon it and taking real and meaningful and immediate action. For many Canadians, this is the first time that they have meaningfully engaged on this issue. They may have heard about it briefly in school, but maybe it didn't resonate with them at that time. They didn't have their own kids at that time. They couldn't relate to it. They weren't shocked by it. It was simply something that happened to a past generation. But as we've seen this week, that has changed. And when change happens to an individual, when they go from knowing a fact to having something touch their heart, it can have a profound and positive impact. And for me, the moment that I began to grasp what had happened in the residential school system and the multi-generational impact it had on Indigenous people that lived in and around my own community of Chilliwack came when I bought a copy of a book written by a respected local Indigenous leader, Ernie Cray. His book is entitled Stolen from Our Embrace, the abduction of First Nations children, and the restoration of Aboriginal communities. It was first published in 1997 and predates the historic apology to former students of Indian residential schools by more than 10 years. I read it in the time period between the apology and the report of the TRC, and it completely changed the way I thought about Canada's relationship with Indigenous people. It opened my eyes and my heart to the fact that this had not only impacted the survivors, but their children and their children's children. It made me understand intergenerational trauma, which has devastating impacts to this day. The book had a profound impact on my personal and professional life, and I think that many Canadians for the first time have had a similar experience with the news of the bodies in graves in Kamloops, where we have finally seen and we have finally heard, and we now know that we need to act. So how do we respond? I want to say that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission did not issue recommendations. They issued calls to action, not calls to talking about taking action at some time in the future. And I think, quite frankly, government is designed to fail on this, not the Liberal government, not a Conservative government. And I'm disappointed, quite frankly, that some of the questions I've heard so far have tried to score some old political points and say, well, you should have done better there, or it's not our fault. Who cares? Today, who cares? We're talking about 215 bodies that have been discovered in unmarked graves, and some people want to score cheap political points. I say shame on them. I say we need to work together, and we need to recognize that government, that the system is designed to fail. It's designed to protect the status quo. And in big ways and small, the system of government abhors change, and successive governments have failed to make significant progress in breaking down these barriers. So it's good to have accountability. It's good to take stock of where we've come from and where we need to go, but it's necessary right now to take real, meaningful, and immediate action to take advantage of the spirit of reconciliation that is sweeping across the country. To that end, we have put forward as Conservatives a list of meaningful actions that we believe can assist families and Indigenous communities during this time. We're calling on the government to develop a comprehensive plan to implement TRC calls to action 71 through 76 on missing children and burial information by July 1st. The motion we're talking about today says in 10 days. That sounds good too. Fund the investigation at all former residential schools in Canada where unmarked graves may exist, including the site where 215 children have already been discovered. Ensure that proper resources are allocated for communities to reinter, commemorate, and honor any individuals discovered through the investigation according to the wishes of their next of kin, and develop a detailed and thorough set of resources to educate Canadians of all ages on the tragic history of residential schools in Canada. Now, in addition to that that volume 4 on missing children and unmarked burials, there's another volume 6 on reconciliation. It's 288 pages long, and the TRC provided us a roadmap in that as well. And in it, they say to the Commission, reconciliation is about establishing and maintaining a mutually respectful relationship between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples in this country. For that to happen, there has to be awareness of the past, acknowledgement of the harm that has been inflicted, atonement for the causes, and action to change behavior. So who needs to take action, Mr. Speaker? The government does need to take action, and we need to work together to give them direction, which this motion does. But we also need to take individual action. We need to be compelled to learn more, to understand more, to build key relationships, to understand how important keeping your word is when dealing with Indigenous peoples and Indigenous leaders. We need to open our hearts and we need to believe survivors, as they told us in this case, about these missing children and unmarked graves. So, Mr. Speaker, we all acknowledge the deep sorrow and mourning that all Indigenous peoples and survivors of residential schools are experiencing at this time. The legacy of residential schools is a national shame that has had a profound, lasting, and damaging impact on Indigenous people, culture, heritage, and language. And this discovery is a somber reminder that so much more work needs to be done to address the devastating and harmful effects that residential schools had and still have on many survivors and their communities today. We must work together to ensure we bring our dark history to light, acknowledge it, learn from it, and ensure nothing like it ever happens again. This must be done both collectively through government action and individually through our own personal decisions to learn more, educate ourselves and our children.
Unfortunately, we have run out of time. We'll have to get on to the questions and comment period. We'll go to questions and comments. And firstly, the honourable member for Cowichan, Malahat, Langford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my fellow British Columbian, the member for Chilliwack Hope, for his speech. Today's speech has just made me think of all the times over the past number of decades that Canada has stood on the world stage lecturing other countries about their human rights record while we have been so willfully ignorant of what has gone on in our own backyard. And I appreciate that the member devoted a lot of time about, how we move forward. When I speak to the elders in my community, a lot of them have made mention of the fact that they will never be fully a part of Canada while the Indian Act remains, our most prominent colonial statute. I know he doesn't have a lot of time to answer this, but in how we get rid of that offensive piece of legislation, does he have any thoughts on how we begin that process? Because governments have shown how quickly they can move when the times demand of it through this pandemic. Does he have any opening thoughts on how we can start that process?
The honourable member for Chilliwack Hope.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I have been thinking about that over the last number of days as well. And I think what we tried to do when we were in government is to give communities, give First Nations themselves the opportunity to opt out of large sections of the Indian Act. It's very difficult at this time without recognizing the different size, the different regions, the different opportunities that exist for the different over 600 First Nations to simply eliminate the Indian Act. I think it needs to be done in a careful way and it needs to be First Nations led. But I think what we can do in the immediate term is to provide ways out from underneath the Indian Act through things like First Nations Land Management Act, through things like the Elections Act, opt-in legislation that allows First Nations themselves to decide that they want out from underneath certain sections of the Indian Act. I think we have to let them lead and partner with them to make sure that we get out from underneath that Indian Act as soon as we possibly can.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Indigenous Services.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I thank the Honourable Member for his intervention and his description of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that they're not recommendation, that they're calls to action and require action. As he knows, in the last Parliament, we passed a private member's bill to implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, one of those calls to action in the report, and it was held up by Conservative senators and never got passed. So our government in this Parliament introduced Bill C-15, which would implement UNDRIP, as it's called, and it passed in the House of Commons without Conservative support at all. So the Conservatives did not support it. Now it's gone to the Senate. And I'm just wondering how the Honourable Member can reconcile that the Conservative Party seems to support some of the calls to action, but not all of them. And I'm also wondering if he will commit to helping in the Senate with those Conservative senators to get this bill passed in the Senate to finally implement this call to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
Honourable Member for Chilliwack Hope.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And of course, it was a Conservative government that first recognized the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as an aspirational document. We do have some concerns with how the free, prior, and informed consent provisions of UNDRIP, how they mesh with, quite frankly, the Canadian Constitution, Section 35, and the duty to consult and accommodate, which has been honed over years in the courts and through negotiation. That is the Canadian approach, has been that duty to consult and accommodate. So that was our concern with UNDRIP. It was with the free, prior, and informed consent provisions and how that interacts with our own constitution, which does specifically acknowledge Indigenous rights, and through our own court system, which has specifically endorsed a duty to consult and accommodate where necessary. So that is the reason why we have raised our concerns. The Senate, as the member knows, will take its own decisions, as it always has. And I am sure there will be robust debate in that chamber, which is controlled, quite frankly, right now with the majority of appointees by this Prime Minister.